Atlanta. 43 floors of glass and steel rising above a city that never learned to be quiet. Inside, a conference room full of people who believed they had just won something. They were laughing. A man who had said only 2 words before he walked out. No argument, no defense, just a signature on a letter someone else had already prepared, as if they had known exactly how the morning would end. 4 minutes later, the windows shook. Hot wind. Something deliberate. Something that had been planned long before anyone in that room had thought to plan anything at all. A jet, low, descending toward the roof of the building they were standing inside. The laughter stopped. Like the man they had just. The man with the decade-old pickup truck and the paper bag lunches and the office with a view of the loading dock walked across that rooftop without once looking back. Nobody in the room could explain what they were seeing, but every one of them understood, in the silence that followed, that they had made a very serious mistake. The boardroom laughed. Not the polite kind. Not the people do when a joke lands soft and they're being generous. This was real laughter. The kind that fills a room and bounces off glass and doesn't apologize for itself. 12 people around a conference table on the 15th floor of APEX Aerospace's Atlanta headquarters. 12 people who had just watched Malcolm Hayes sign his name to a resignation letter. Now 12 people letting themselves feel good about it. Vanessa Carter stood at the head of the table with her arms crossed and her chin lifted just enough. Satisfied. That was the word. Looked like a woman who had been waiting 14 months to exhale and had finally found the moment. The resignation letter sat on the table between them, ink still fresh, just looking at it the way you look at a problem that has finally been resolved. Malcolm didn't look at anyone. He stood, buttoned the middle button of his jacket, and said 2 words before he walked to the door. Good luck. That was it. Words, no edge to them, no venom, no theater. Just the plain, unhurried delivery of a man who meant exactly what he said and nothing more. Nobody knew what to do with it. So the laughter continued, quieter now, less certain of itself, ailing behind him as he walked out. He took the stairs down 1 floor, faster than the elevator. He walked past Angela Young's desk outside his office, and she looked up and looked at him and said nothing, which was more than most people could have managed in the same moment. She had worked with him for 9 years, understood his patterns the way people understand weather. Not by reading instruments, but by living alongside it long enough to feel the shift before it arrives. Her silence was the most honest goodbye she knew how to give. Sat at his desk for 11 minutes, sent 3 emails, short, administrative, the kind that looked like housekeeping to anyone who might scan them later, but mean something specific to the people who receive them. Picked up nothing from the desk, except the canvas bag he'd brought in that morning. He walked through the 14th floor without stopping, past the operations team bullpen, where 2 analysts were working on freight routing models and didn't look up, past the break room, where the coffee machine was cycling through, down the corridor, into the elevator, the lobby where the security guard at the front desk nodded at Malcolm, the way he had nodded at him every morning for 9 years. Malcolm nodded back. That was the last ordinary thing that happened at APEX Aerospace for quite some time. 4 minutes after Malcolm stepped out of the building, the sound arrived, not a rumble, not the dull vibration of street traffic or rooftop HVAC, a full bicycle push of air pressure against the glass walls of the 15th floor conference room. The kind of sound that registers in the chest before the brain catches up with it. Inside the room, Lewis was already moving through a mental checklist of what needed to happen before the board vote. Vanessa was across the room speaking quietly with 2 other senior leaders. Resignation letter sat on the table between empty water glasses, then the glass vibrated, every head turned. The Gulf Stream came in from the north, low enough that you could read the tail number if you were quick about it, banking smoothly over the Atlanta skyline with the kind of approach angle that required both an exceptional aircraft and an exceptional pilot. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't showy. It was precise, like the way that things done by people who have done them many times tend to be precise. The rooftop pad had been there since the building's original construction. The architect, working in the late 1980s, had specified it in the original drawings as a forward-looking feature. Over the decades, it had become a platform for HVAC maintenance and an occasional break spot for facilities staff. But 18 months ago, active certification had been filed with the city by a legal entity whose name appeared in no internal APEX Aerospace documents. No one had flagged it. No one had asked. Because when you're running a mid-sized aerospace company with thinning margins and a board watching everything, you don't spend energy investigating the administrative paperwork of your own building's rooftop. A650 set down with controlled precision, Malcolm Hayes emerged from the stairwell access door and crossed the rooftop in a straight line. Same jacket, same bag, same unhurried pace he carried everywhere. A member of the aircraft's ground crew met him at the base of the boarding stairs. They exchanged a few words. Then Malcolm walked up, ducked through the door, and the crew sealed it behind him. The jet lifted off the way it had landed, without drama, without flourish. It banked south over the city and climbed until it was a white shape against the gray Atlanta afternoon. Then nothing. Vanessa Carter stood at the window with both palms flat against the glass. Just the posture of someone watching a problem disappear. The posture of someone realizing the frame they'd been using was the wrong one entirely. Jeffrey Lewis stood 2 feet behind her, and for the first time since Vanessa had known him, nothing ready. One of the junior directors pulled up the tail registration on his phone within 4 minutes. The aircraft was registered to a holding company, Vantage Meridian Holdings, properly filed, no public presence, no press releases, no website, just a name attached to a legal structure that was, as the junior director described it quietly to the person beside him, very deliberately constructed. No one in that room had ever heard of Vantage Meridian Holdings. But it had been landing on their building's roof, and it had just taken Malcolm Hayes somewhere south of Atlanta at cruising speed, with the ease of a departure planned long before anyone in that room had thought to plan anything at all. Malcolm Hayes had come to APEX Aerospace 9 years earlier the same way he came to most things, without announcement, without ceremony, without a story that explained itself easily. They had been referred through a former logistics director who had worked with him briefly at a regional carrier in Tennessee. The referral was not enthusiastic, which was unusual for referrals. It was simply accurate. The logistics director had written 3 sentences. The first said Malcolm was available. The second said he solved problems that other people couldn't. The third said he would not tell you how he did it, which some people found frustrating, and which the logistics director personally found irrelevant given the results. Raymond Harris. They had built APEX Aerospace from a regional charter service into a mid-sized aerospace contractor over 4 decades, read the 3 sentences, and hired Malcolm on the basis of a single 40-minute phone call. Not have explained exactly why. He told his assistant afterward that Malcolm was the kind of man who didn't need to convince you. He just needed you to pay attention. Malcolm was 58 years old. He had the build of someone who had done physical work at some point in his life and hadn't stopped moving since, though the nature of the work had shifted. He kept his hair close, the same rotation of dark slacks and button-down shirts. Nothing pressed particularly sharp, nothing worn enough to comment on. His voice was low and even, and he used it sparingly. He drove a GMC Sierra from 2011, dark gray, rust along the rear wheel wells and a cracked dashboard mount where a phone holder had once been. He parked in the general employee lot 3 rows from the entrance every morning regardless of weather. The parking structure had reserved executive spaces on level 2, and he had never used one. His office was on the 14th floor, 1 level below the executive suite, a north-facing window that looked out over the freight-loading docks rather than the city skyline. He had never mentioned this arrangement to anyone. The operations team had assumed for years that he simply preferred the view, the kind of assumption people make about quiet men who don't complain. Most days he ate lunch at Crown Diner. A 4-minute walk from the building's side entrance, ceramic mugs, laminated menus that hadn't been updated in years, with 7 stools and 4 booths along the window. The woman who worked the morning and lunch shift, Diane Wells, knew his order before he sat down. 2 eggs, wheat toast, black coffee, regardless of the hour. Left a consistent tip and occasionally asked about her daughter, who was in her 2nd year at Georgia State. He was not a man who collected relationships, but he maintained the ones he made with a steady, uncomplicated attention that people noticed without being able to name. Angela Young had told a colleague once, quietly, Malcolm was the only executive she'd worked for in 20 years of professional support who remembered her mother's name. Not as a managed detail, not something reviewed before conversations. Remembered because he had listened the first time and hadn't needed a system to retain it. His title was Senior Director of Operations. The title was accurate the way a foundation is accurately called a foundation. Accurate, not complete. What it actually did was harder to represent on an organizational chart. He was the person APEX called when something was coming apart in ways that couldn't be managed through normal channels. A supply chain collapsing 3 weeks before a government delivery deadline. A regulatory filing mishandled simultaneously by 2 separate departments, each blaming the other. Maintenance crew in Memphis that had stopped showing up without explanation and without anyone in the executive suite understanding why. Malcolm would board a commercial flight, always coach, late always an aisle seat, and return 4 or 5 days later with the problem resolved and no explanation that followed a logical sequence anyone else could trace. He wrote his operational reports in plain language. He submitted them on time, never asked to be mentioned when things went well. When something went wrong under his watch, he used the word we and meant it to include everyone, including himself. When something went right, he said the team with the same completeness. People who worked directly under him respected him without being able to articulate exactly why. It had something to do with the fact that he never raised his voice and never needed to. Something to do with the way he absorbed bad news without flinching and without immediately shifting the weight of it onto whoever delivered it. Something to do with the way he showed up, day after day, without narrative around it. Without making his consistency into a performance, Raymond Harris had understood this about him, which was perhaps why what happened 40 months after Raymond stepped down for health reasons had the particular shape it did, because the person who replaced Raymond did not understand it at all. Not yet. Vanessa Carter was 34 years old, and she had been building toward this her entire adult life, whether she'd framed it that way or not. Raymond was her father. Had started APEX Aerospace with 3 leased aircraft and a maintenance contract for a regional freight company in 1983. He had grown it slowly, the way people grow things they intend to keep. Defense contracts, commercial maintenance division, a reputation in the industry for delivering on time and keeping their word, which takes decades to build, and a single bad year to damage beyond recovery. He had called Vanessa home 18 months ago, when his health became something he could no longer manage around. The board had approved her appointment with the careful optimism of people who wanted to believe the thing they were hoping for. Those 34. She had a Wharton MBA and 3 years at a private equity firm in New York before she came back to Atlanta. She was sharp in the ways that are visible, quick in meetings, polished in front of cameras, decisive in the way she used language. What she had inherited along with the company was a financial picture that required more than decisiveness. The books were not fraudulent, but they were not clean either. Revenue had softened over the past 3 years as defense contracts dried up, and the commercial division struggled to compete with larger firms that had deeper maintenance networks. Margins were narrowing in ways that would become visible to outside investors within 18 months if nothing changed. Vanessa knew this. She had known it before she took the chair. What she chose to do with that knowledge was the thing that would define everything that followed. Jeffrey Lewis had come into her orbit at a conference in Washington 9 months before any of this reached a crisis point. A financial advisor who operated through a consulting firm with a name that suggested stability without specifying anything. He wore his suits the way certain men do, as a form of argument before he'd said a word. Presented himself as a specialist in restructuring for aerospace and defense companies. He was articulate and very good at making complicated financial maneuvers sound not only logical, but inevitable. The proposal was straightforward in its presentation. Bring in a focused group of private investors to stabilize the balance sheet in exchange for a minority stake in the commercial division. He had the contacts. He had the structure ready. All Vanessa needed to do was make the case to the board, which she was well positioned to do, and which Jeffrey understood when he walked into the room. Vanessa did not fully see, or chose not to fully examine, was that the investor group Jeffrey had assembled had interests that did not align with where the company needed to go. The restructuring he was proposing was not designed to make APEX Aerospace stronger. It was designed to make certain assets separable, easier to isolate, easier to move, to sell off in pieces if the larger structure eventually became inconvenient. But Jeffrey presented everything in the language of growth and stability. Vanessa was under enough pressure from the board that the language landed exactly where he needed it to. She heard what she needed to hear, not because she was careless, like she was exhausted and behind on time, and the proposal gave her a path when she needed one. Malcolm noticed the discrepancy in the financial models before anyone else. He was not looking for it. I'd been reviewing operational cost projections for the Memphis maintenance facility, a routine exercise he did quarterly, comparing actuals against forecasts to identify where the gaps were widening. He cross-referenced a revenue projection that didn't match the contracts he knew were active. The difference was not dramatic. It was not the kind of number that would trigger an automatic audit flag, but it was a direction, a deliberate lean. Whoever had adjusted the figures had made them point consistently toward distress. A company in distress could justify emergency restructuring. Urgency restructuring could justify bringing in outside investors on terms a healthy company would never agree to. He went back 6 months, then 8 months. The pattern was there every time, consistent and intentional. Like someone had been quietly reshaping the financial picture of APEX Aerospace, not stealing from it yet, setting the conditions under which theft would become structurally possible, laying a foundation for something that hadn't happened yet, and wouldn't happen quickly and would be very difficult to unwind once the first transaction cleared. Malcolm sat with the data for 2 days, organized everything into a single document, underlying contract records, forecast figures, the gap between them, broken out month by month. He put the document on a USB drive and printed a hard copy. Then he requested a private meeting with Vanessa Carter. She gave him 30 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon, between a call with a government procurement officer and a dinner with a potential board member. Arrived at her office on the 15th floor on time and placed both the printed document and the USB drive on the surface between them without preamble. She looked at the materials, maybe 90 seconds. Then she looked up at him. "Where did you get these projections?" he explained. "The internal forecasting system, cross-referenced with contract records accessible through his operational role." Walked her through what the discrepancy suggested and what it would mean for the board's upcoming vote on the investor restructuring proposal. He was direct and specific and did not editorialize. He did not tell her what to conclude, showed her what he had found and let the information be what it was. She did not thank him. She asked him to leave the materials and said she would look into it. Her expression gave nothing away. The particular careful blankness of someone processing fast while showing nothing. He left the office believing he had done the right thing. He believed the matter would be handled appropriately. It was wrong about what she would do next, but he was not surprised when he found out. 48 hours of that meeting, Jeffrey Lewis had been informed. He didn't panic. He had been in enough difficult rooms for long enough to know that panic was a resource you spent only when you had no better options. Better options. He had been managing this situation for 9 months and had anticipated that someone inside the company might eventually look at the numbers from the right angle. He had a response prepared, not on paper. In his head, he kept the things that mattered. He sat down with Vanessa and reframed everything. Malcolm Hayes was not a concerned employee. He was a destabilizing presence. He had been building a case against her leadership for months, not because he had found something genuine, but because he was positioning himself as the person who saved the company, which would give him leverage over the board and make him untouchable. Jeffrey said all of this calmly, authority of someone offering strategic analysis rather than fabrication. He framed Malcolm's findings not as evidence but as a political move in a game. Vanessa hadn't known she was playing. They'd been running on thin sleep and thinner patience for 14 months. The board was watching everything she did. The restructuring deal was the centerpiece of her first-year plan. It collapsed under internal scrutiny before it reached a vote. The narrative would not be kind to her. She had come home to prove something, to a board that had approved her with cautious optimism, a industry that watched when a founder's child took the chair. To herself, maybe, in the hours after midnight when she couldn't sleep and the numbers kept rearranging themselves behind her eyes. Made a decision that had more to do with control than with facts. And she made it quickly, which is how those decisions tend to get made. Malcolm received a calendar invitation 3 days after his meeting with Vanessa. A subject lined Leadership Alignment Session. The time was 2 in the afternoon. The location was the executive conference room on the 15th floor. He went. He knew before he opened the door. Not because he had been told, as he had been in enough rooms preceded by calendar invitations, with neutral subject lines to understand what the configuration meant. The full senior leadership team, 12 people, plus Jeffrey Lewis at the far end of the table, meshed with the ease of someone who had never considered that his presence there required justification. Vanessa stood at the front, addressed more formally than usual, a choice Malcolm registered the way he registered all small strategic choices, without commenting, without reacting, just noting it as information. She began with prepared language, the kind that sounds neutral when it starts and becomes specific only after it has already established its frame. Organizational direction, leadership accountability, the importance of clarity in strategic initiatives. Delivered it without looking directly at him, because looking directly at someone while you dismantle them requires a particular kind of nerve that not everyone has when the moment actually arrives. Malcolm listened. Reached the specific part, the overreach, the destabilizing pattern, the individuals whose scope had expanded beyond what the organization required. He did not move, did not shift in his seat, not look at the people around the table, who were looking at the table instead of at him. She finished. The room held the stillness of people who know something uncomfortable is happening and have decided not to be the one to name it. Malcolm asked one question. Will the financial data I submitted 3 days ago be reviewed by an independent party before the board votes on the restructuring proposal? Vanessa said that all relevant materials were being handled through appropriate channels. It was a sentence designed to mean nothing while sounding like a complete answer. He had heard variations of it before, understood exactly what it communicated, which was that the answer was no, and that this had already been decided, and that no version of this conversation would change it. He nodded once, reached into the folder he had brought, a standard manila folder, the kind he carried to every meeting, and removed a single sheet of paper. He looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. Then he took the pen from his shirt pocket and signed his name at the bottom of the resignation letter that had been placed in his folder by someone in Vanessa's administrative team who had known before he arrived how this meeting would end. Slid it across the table, not pushed, slid, precise and unhurried. The room exhaled. Somewhere near the back of the table, someone made a sound, short, involuntary, quickly suppressed. Jeffrey Lewis laughed with the confidence of someone giving a room permission, and 3 other people followed. Vanessa allowed herself a small, composed smile. 14 months of maneuvering, and she had moved the most pieces to remove, had handed her exactly what she wanted without a single additional move required. Malcolm stood, buttoned his jacket, and said the only thing he said before he walked out, "Luck with the vote." Nobody knew what to make of it, so they left it where it landed. Attorneys Vanessa engaged spent 4 days on Vantage Meridian Holdings before returning with a 2-page memo that said the same thing in different ways. The ownership structure was legitimate, properly filed across multiple states, legally impenetrable, without a court order for which there was no probable cause, because there was no identifiable illegal act that would justify requesting one. The structure was circular in the way that careful legal engineering tends to be. Not hiding anything exactly, just making the path to the center long enough that most people gave up following it. Attorneys recommended she stop pulling at the thread. She told them to keep pulling. The second thread connected to a private equity subsidiary registered in Delaware. That subsidiary connected to a real estate trust in Nevada. That trust connected back to Vantage Meridian. 4 days of legal work to complete a circle that ended exactly where it started. Jeffrey told her to let it go. He said it with the calm of someone offering strategy rather than instruction. Paying attention to the inquiry would signal to the board that something unusual had happened with Malcolm's departure, and that was the last thing she needed before the restructuring vote. She listened. She filed the memo. But she kept a copy in the top drawer of her desk and opened that drawer sometimes, in the quiet of the office after everyone else had left, for reasons she couldn't fully explain. Just looked at it. Let it sit there, being the thing she hadn't resolved. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the background of financial systems Vanessa wasn't watching because she was watching the things Jeffrey was directing her attention toward. At 3 separate financial institutions, a series of debt acquisition transactions were processed over the course of 2 weeks. The buyer was an investment vehicle called Caraway Capital. No press releases, no public-facing web presence, but quietly active. In the aerospace and defense sector for nearly 7 years, accumulating positions in companies that were strategically positioned but financially stressed. The kind of companies that needed patient, sizable support rather than the loud kind. The debts Caraway Capital was purchasing were not random. They were specific instruments, tied to financing agreements that APEX had used to manage relationships with key parts suppliers during the revenue softness of the previous 2 years. Deferred maintenance contracts representing obligations the company had pushed forward when cash was tight. 2 convertible notes issued to mid-tier suppliers who had agreed to carry risk on APEX's behalf during a difficult quarter. The instrument was on its own unremarkable. Together they represented leverage over a significant portion of APEX Aerospace operational continuity. If those instruments were ever called due simultaneously, the disruption would not be something the company could absorb without immediate outside intervention. The founding documents of Caraway Capital listed a single individual as the original managing partner, a woman named Lorraine Mitchell, who died of cancer 3 years prior. Jeffrey's sources in the debt markets flagged Caraway Capital's activity within a week. He absorbed the information and made a decision about what to do with it. He did not share it with Vanessa. Instead, he told her something simpler and more useful to his own position. He told her that Malcolm Hayes had not accepted his departure quietly, that he was making moves in the background, that his goal was to destabilize the company so completely that the board would have no choice but to accept outside intervention, specifically intervention from Malcolm or entities aligned with him. Jeffrey called it a long game. White said Malcolm had been playing it for years. Said the quiet, unremarkable man Vanessa had removed from the building was not what he appeared to be, and that the ease with which he had walked away should be the most alarming thing of all. Vanessa absorbed this. It did not fully convince her, but it did something more useful to Jeffrey than convincing her. It kept her slightly off balance, afraid of the wrong thing. Dependent on him for context she couldn't independently verify, as exactly where he needed her to be. There were things Malcolm Hayes had never told anyone at APEX Aerospace. Not because he was guarding secrets in the dramatic sense, but because the people around him had never asked the right questions, and he had never felt the need to volunteer answers to questions that weren't being asked. Lorraine Mitchell had been from Memphis originally. They had met in Indianapolis at a logistics conference where neither of them was scheduled to present, and both had ended up at the same panel discussion about cargo routing inefficiencies in the Southeast Corridor. Asked a question that changed the direction of the room. He noticed the question before he noticed her, which she found, when he told her this years later, very accurate and not at all surprising. She had a mind for systems. Not in the abstract way people use that phrase about someone good at chess or strategic thinking. In the specific, granular, load-bearing way of someone who understood how components connect to each other under stress. Look at a logistics network and see not just how it worked, but where it would fail and what would cascade from that failure. and how far the cascade would travel before it ran out of energy. They had started Caraway Capital together 7 years before Malcolm walked into the APEX Aerospace lobby for the first time, not with a vision of what it would become. A specific problem they had both been watching develop across the aerospace sector for years. Companies doing essential, irreplaceable work, maintenance, logistics, supply chain, being quietly targeted by investment structures whose interest was not in the work but in the extractable value of the assets surrounding it. Contracts, equipment, real estate, proprietary systems, things that could be separated from the operational function and sold or leveraged or used as collateral for something entirely unrelated to keeping aircraft safe. The people doing the actual work, the crew chiefs, the logistic coordinators, the parts specialists who had spent decades developing judgment that can't be documented in a manual. Those people had no seat in those conversations. They were part of the asset, the extractable value, the thing being discussed rather than the people doing the discussing. Caraway Capital was built to sit in the spaces those investment structures targeted, to hold the instruments that gave leverage over operational continuity, not to use them aggressively, to ensure that someone with different intentions couldn't use a similar position to dismantle the functions those people depended on. Horizon Air Logistics had come out of the same thinking years after Caraway was established. If Caraway worked on the financial side, the debt instruments, the convertible notes, lender agreements that determined whether a company could stay operational through a disruption, then something needed to work on the operational side, the actual supply chain, the parts flowing between facilities, operation systems that determined which aircraft got serviced when and by whom. They had started with 2 logistics contracts and a leased warehouse in Indianapolis. Lorraine had run the operations. Malcolm had handled the relationships. Like 3 years, it had grown into something neither of them had originally planned for. Just 5 years, it was managing supply chain coordination for carriers that didn't know Horizon's ownership structure and wouldn't have been able to find it if they'd looked, because the work was seamless and the pricing was fair and the systems never failed. Together, Caraway and Horizon formed a position that could protect a company or dismantle one, depending on who held it, depending on what they chose to do. Lorraine had been diagnosed in the spring of what would become the last year she worked. Pancreatic. The kind of diagnosis that doesn't offer negotiation. They had kept working through the first 8 months, because stopping was not something she was built for, and because the work organized her days in a way that the alternative did not. She died in late autumn of house they had bought together in Buckhead 3 years earlier, Malcolm beside her, and the work still running, and the systems still holding, and the people who depended on those systems, unaware that the person most responsible for the architecture of their stability was lying in a room watching the light change through the window, but kept going because it was what she would have done, and because he did not know a better reason to continue anything than the one she had shown him. That you continue because the work matters to the people it serves. Those people did not stop mattering when the work became difficult. He had come to APEX Aerospace 1 year after she died, a company doing exactly the kind of work that Lorraine had spent years protecting, mid-sized, historically sound. There is the kind of leader who built things slowly and kept his word. A company where the gap between the executive suite and the maintenance floor was still crossable if you were paying attention. I'd taken the job because it was the job. The work itself. Not a position above the work or adjacent to it or designed to oversee it from a sufficient distance that the decisions remained clean. The work. 9 years inside the actual machinery of the company. The scheduling systems, the vendor relationships, the maintenance protocols, the regulatory filings, and understood it at the level of function rather than the level of reporting, a different level entirely. He had also, in those 9 years, been watching. He had identified the pattern in APEX Aerospace financial data not 7 weeks before he brought the memo to Vanessa's office, identified it 4 months earlier. He spent those 4 months doing 2 things simultaneously: building the documentation, organizing the evidence, tracing the relationships, identifying the source, and watching Vanessa Carter. trying to understand whether she was complicit in what was being constructed around her, or whether she was being managed by someone better at this than she was. It was not a small distinction. Who was complicit was a problem of a specific kind, with responses that ran through the board and regulatory channels. A CEO being used without fully understanding it was a different problem entirely, requiring a different response, and getting the distinction wrong in either direction would cause damage that couldn't be undone. He had watched her for 4 months. He noticed the things she pushed back on in meetings, like the questions she asked that Jeffrey Lewis answered smoothly and that she accepted without pressing further. The moments when her face shifted from decision mode to something more uncertain and then shifted back, watched her relationship with Jeffrey, the dependence in it, the way she calibrated her read of situations against his, the way his confidence operated as a substitute for certainty she didn't yet have. They'd brought the memo to her office because he needed to know what she would do with it. And she had told him, without meaning to, by choosing Jeffrey's version over the evidence in front of her. She had chosen convenience as a human choice, which told him she was frightened and under pressure, and being managed by someone with considerably more experience at this than she had. Not complicit, just not yet awake. They had walked out of the building and boarded the Gulf Stream and let Vantage Meridian Holdings become the thing people looked at instead of the things they should have been examining, because he needed time. Not much. Enough for Vanessa to sit with what she had done and begin asking the questions she hadn't been asking. 3 weeks after the resignation, Pamela Scott called on a Saturday morning. Pamela was a board member. 62 years old, last 30 years in commercial aviation, the kind of presence that other board members paid attention to, without always being able to explain why. Had served on the APEX board since Raymond Harris invited her 8 years ago, and had the reputation, among people who knew her well, of asking the question everyone else had decided not to ask. The call was brief. Pleasant tone throughout. Asked about the restructuring timeline, expressed support for the process, mentioned a conference she'd attended in Dallas the previous month. Then, almost as an afterthought, near the end of the call, she asked a single question. Had much to do with Horizon Air Logistics? Vanessa said she knew the name but didn't have strong familiarity. Interesting, Pamela said, and changed the subject. The call ended warmly and without resolution. Vanessa searched the name before she'd set the phone down. Horizon Air Logistics was a privately held company with no public profile, but a substantial operational footprint. Managed supply chain coordination for 6 major commercial carriers and 3 regional freight operators, controlling the flow of parts, maintenance materials, and ground support equipment across dozens of hubs throughout the country. Like the industry, it was known as the company that kept other companies running, the kind of infrastructure that only becomes visible when it stops working, which it hadn't in the 5 years it had been operating at scale. Never sought outside investment, had never issued a press release, had never appeared on any industry awards list or conference speaking roster, built specifically to be indispensable without being prominent. Ownership was not publicly disclosed. The timing of Pamela's question was not something Vanessa could dismiss. Pamela had been on the APEX board for 8 years and did not ask things by accident. Vanessa decided to find out directly. A contact in the private aviation community called her back on a Tuesday with a detail that cost them both 30 minutes to locate and confirm. An matching Malcolm Hayes' description had been seen at the fixed base operator terminal at Peachtree City Airport on 2 occasions in the past 10 days. Peachtree City was a private aviation hub 40 minutes south of downtown Atlanta, aired enough to avoid attention. Large enough to handle business-level traffic without anyone noting it in ways that surfaced publicly. Vanessa drove there herself. She told no one where she was going. They arrived 90 minutes before the second confirmed sighting time and parked a rental car in the facility lot with a direct sightline to the terminal entrance. She sat with the engine off and the heat running and the particular discomfort of someone built for action who has placed herself in a situation requiring complete stillness. For 64 minutes, nothing happened. Ground crew moved equipment. A small turboprop departed for what looked like a short regional hop. A fuel truck completed a circuit. Vanessa drank coffee from a travel mug she'd bought at a gas station outside the airport and watched and waited and felt, at passing minute, the specific frustration of someone who is committed to a course of action and is waiting for it to begin. Then a black SUV arrived at the far end of the tarmac. Malcolm Hayes stepped out before the vehicle had fully stopped. Dark slacks, simple jacket, the same canvas bag. He shook hands with the driver without looking around. The way people move when they're comfortable in a place and have been there many times. And walked toward the terminal entrance with the same unhurried pace he carried everywhere. Of the next 15 minutes, 3 additional vehicles arrived. The men who stepped out of them were not people Vanessa recognized immediately. She photographed what she could of the license plates. Partial numbers. Enough. By the time she drove back to Atlanta, she had identified 2 of them through her contacts. One was a managing director at a Texas-based private equity firm, with positions in multiple U.S. aerospace companies. Other was a former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense who had transitioned to private advisory work and now operated out of a firm in Virginia specializing in aerospace and defense sector investments. The third man she was unable to identify that day, but she held his face in her memory with the specific attention she gave to things she did not yet understand. That Vanessa did not know, as she merged onto the freeway south of Peachtree City, was that a Horizon Air Logistics security contractor had flagged her rental car's license plate within 8 minutes of her pulling into the facility lot. The terminal was one of 4 Horizon facilities used for sensitive logistics coordination, and monitoring the surrounding access points was standard operating procedure. Malcolm Hayes had been informed of her presence before she finished adjusting her mirrors. He had allowed it. She didn't know that either. She didn't know it because the version of Malcolm Hayes she understood. The quiet operations director who drove a decade-old pickup and ate at the same diner every day was not a man who had security contractors and private terminals and access to an aircraft worth more than the combined annual compensation of every person in the APEX executive suite. So she had understood. But the Gulfstream had landed on her building's roof and taken him south, and the holding company and the attorneys, and the memo in the top drawer now, this, Peachtree City. The managing director, deputy undersecretary, the third man she couldn't name, were beginning to form a shape she could almost see. Not clearly yet, not completely, but enough to know the shape was much larger than the space she had assumed it occupied. She could not tell Jeffrey what she had seen. This was the first decision she had made entirely without him in weeks, and she noticed the feeling of it, small and cold and clear, a clarity feels when it arrives after a long stretch of noise. She merged onto the interstate and drove north toward Atlanta and let the feeling sit without trying to explain it yet. There would be time for that. The board vote was still 11 days away. Jeffrey was still operating under the assumption that she was operating under his. The memo was still in the top drawer, and Malcolm Hayes was somewhere past the Georgia horizon, aircraft she couldn't trace, with people she had just started to understand the significance of. The coffee in the travel mug had gone cold. She didn't notice. That night, Vanessa sat in her office after the building had emptied. Lights spread south from the windows. She opened the top drawer, took out the memo. Read it again, though she could have reconstructed most of it from memory. Then she set it down and sat with the accumulated weight of the past 3 weeks, and tried to separate what she knew from what she had been told. She had known on some level, like Malcolm walked into her office with the printed document and the USB drive, that what he was showing her was real. She had known it the way you know things that would be costly to act on, looked at 90 seconds of his materials, and made a calculation about what was more useful to her in that moment, his findings or Jeffrey's version of his findings. She had chosen Jeffrey's version, because it kept the path forward clear, because the board was watching, because the restructuring was the thing she had built her first year around, and if it collapsed under internal scrutiny before it reached a vote, the story told about her in this industry would not be recoverable. She had made a choice, not an accidental one, a deliberate one, and the choice had consequences she was only beginning to map. 11 days until the board vote. 11 days to figure out what she actually knew, what she could verify, and what she was going to do with it. The memo went back in the drawer. The city kept its lights on outside the windows, indifferent and complete. It's evening without any awareness of what was being decided in the building at its center. She closed the drawer and sat very still for a long time in the dark. Acid, when the report came back from the Horizon contractor that a rental car registered to Vanessa Carter had been in the Peachtree City lot for 94 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon, Malcolm had felt something he didn't name precisely but recognized as close to relief. Not because she'd found him, because she'd gone looking, without telling Jeffrey, without asking permission, on her own. But the specific discomfort of someone doing something they don't know how to do yet, but doing it anyway because the alternative is worse. That was what he had needed to see, and he had seen it. The documents spread across the table in the G650's forward cabin, organized them into 3 stacks: the financial analysis, the reconciliation, he had obtained through a process that had taken 11 weeks and that he would not elaborate on when the time came to present them. The process was legal and documented, but explaining it would take time the room would need for other things. The Gulf Stream continued south. The work was not finished, but it was close. Weeks after Malcolm Hayes signed his name and walked out of a room that laughed at him. Vanessa Carter was not sleeping well. This was not new. She had not slept well since the week she took the chair. But before, laziness had a shape she recognized. The productive kind. The kind where your brain keeps working on a problem and occasionally surfaces with something useful at 2 in the morning. Now it was a different shape. Formless. The kind that produces nothing except the accumulation of hours spent staring at a ceiling, while the city ran itself outside the window without asking her permission. She got up at 5 most mornings and was at her desk before 6. Like the building was empty at that hour. The cleaning crew finished their last floor by 4:30, and the earliest arrivals from operations didn't come in until 7. Those 90 minutes to herself, and she used them the way she used everything, with purpose, working through the stack of decisions the previous day had left unresolved. Except lately, the stack kept growing faster than she could work through it. And the thing at the bottom of it, the thing she kept moving other things on top of, was the memo in the top drawer, and the Gulf Stream, and Peachtree City. Asa Scott's question, which had been asked pleasantly, and had meant something else entirely. She told herself she was managing it. She told herself, this, the way you tell yourself something, you need to be true in order to keep moving. A restructuring vote was 10 days out, then 9, then 8. Jeffrey Lewis called every day, sometimes twice. The calls were always purposeful. Updates on the investor group's positioning, timeline refinements, board dynamics, had a way of filling in every gap before she could sit in it long enough to form her own questions, which she had understood for months as competence and was only now beginning to consider from a different angle. Not tell him about Peachtree City. She did not tell him about the 2 people she had identified, the managing director at the Texas firm, the former deputy undersecretary. Held that information in a specific internal compartment and kept the compartment locked when she was on calls with Jeffrey, which required more deliberate effort than she expected, because she was a person who processed out loud, out by talking, who had for 14 months been processing and thinking almost exclusively in conversation with Jeffrey Lewis. The absence of that outlet created a pressure she hadn't anticipated, but she held it. Actor Bryant had been CFO at APEX Aerospace for 6 years. He was 51 years old, article in a way that manifested as quietness. The kind of person in a finance role who understood that the most useful thing he could offer was accuracy rather than narrative. He did not embellish. He did not minimize. Read numbers the way certain people read people, with a patience that didn't hurry toward conclusions. Vanessa called him on a Thursday morning. She asked him to close his office door before she said anything else. Then she asked him to run an independent reconciliation of the commercial division revenue forecasts against the actual contract values in the system, not the summary level figures, the underlying contracts, the actual signed agreements, delivery schedules, the payment terms. She wanted to know what the revenue picture looked like when you built it from the contracts up rather than from the forecast down. Quietly, she said. The word sat between them for a moment, but carrying more weight than its two syllables suggested. Understood, Victor said nothing else. She did not tell him why. She did not mention Malcolm's memo, which was still in the drawer and which she had not shared with anyone. Since the afternoon Malcolm left it on her desk. She did not mention Jeffrey, asked for the reconciliation. And she asked for discretion, and she hung up and sat with the particular discomfort of a person who has started a process they cannot control the outcome of. 26 hours later, her phone rang. Victor's voice was professional, controlled, but tightly managed in the way that voices get managed when the person behind them has found something they didn't expect and has decided that how they deliver the finding matters as much as what they deliver. She knew before he said a word. The numbers Malcolm had flagged were accurate. The revenue forecasts Jeffrey had been using to justify the emergency restructuring terms did not match the company's actual financial position. APEX Aerospace was under pressure, real, documented, acquiring response, but it was not as distressed as the proposal required it to appear. The gap between what the forecast showed and what the contract supported was not accidental variation. It was directional, consistent. The same lean, applied the same way, across the same categories, for long enough that it had become the foundation of the argument for emergency intervention. You didn't need emergency intervention for a company in manageable difficulty. They did it for a company in crisis. And if the company wasn't in crisis, you shaped the numbers until it appeared to be. How far back does it go? Her voice came out level. She was quite proud of that. Okay. You're proud of small things when larger things are falling. Victor said he'd found it consistently for 8 months, possibly longer, but 8 months was what he could document cleanly. She thanked him, asked him to put nothing in writing yet, told him she'd be in touch within 48 hours with next steps. She set the phone down and sat in her office for a long time without moving. The thing about sitting with the full shape of something is that you can't unknow it once you've seen it. You can put it down. You can close the drawer on it and choose someone else's version for weeks because it's more useful to what you're trying to do. But once you've let yourself see the actual shape, once you've let a careful, controlled voice fill in the piece you'd been refusing to fill in yourself, the shape doesn't go away. Vanessa spent 2 hours that evening going back through everything. Not the way she'd reviewed it before, looking for reassurance that things were manageable. Looking for what was being hidden. Starting from the assumption that Malcolm had been right and working forward from there. A structuring proposal was designed to transfer APEX Aerospace's most valuable assets, the defense maintenance contracts, the proprietary component supply agreements developed over 30 years by Raymond Harris and the people he had built teams around, to entities controlled, through several layers, for the same holding structure that Jeffrey's investor group operated through. The public announcement would describe it as recapitalization. What it actually was, stripped of the language, was the controlled removal of the company's core value, executed under the cover of a financial crisis that had been carefully shaped to justify it. Jeffrey had designed his exit before he finished designing his entry. Advisory agreement paid out in full upon completion of the restructuring transaction, regardless of what happened to the company afterward. He would be gone before the consequences became visible. That was the point. That had always been the point. She made 3 phone calls that night. The first was to Victor Bryant. She asked him to prepare a full independent audit request that could be submitted to the board, gave him 48 hours, and told him to document everything he could access without triggering a system flag. The second was to Pamela Scott. She called at 9:15, late for a board member call, but not so late that it signaled crisis. Pamela picked up on the second ring. Vanessa told her what she had. Not everything, not yet, but enough. The shape of it, direction of the financial manipulation, the gap between the forecasts and the actual contracts, the advisory agreement structure that guaranteed Jeffrey's payout regardless of outcome. Pamela listened without interrupting. Vanessa finished. There was a brief silence that carried something in it. Something measured and unsurprised. I've been waiting for this call, just that. No elaboration, no told you so, isn't. Just the plain acknowledgement of a person who had been watching from a slightly different angle and had not said anything because saying something required the person at the center to arrive at it themselves. The third call was to a number she too had tracked down through the debt acquisition filings, a number associated with Caraway Capital. They'd spent 4 hours finding it and was not entirely certain it was still active or connected to anyone who would respond. It rang 6 times, transferred to a voicemail that offered no name, just a prompt. She left a message, direct and brief. She said she needed to speak with whoever controlled the Caraway Capital position in APEX Aerospace. She said she understood the situation better than she had 4 weeks ago. She said she was asking for a conversation, as a favor. She hung up and waited. Nothing came back. Not that night, not the next morning, not through the weekend that followed, during which she attended a board pre-meeting dinner that Jeffrey had organized and sat across the table from him for 3 hours while he talked about investor positioning and board dynamics and the importance of presenting a unified front going into the vote. H him during those 3 hours with a different quality of attention than she'd brought to any previous conversation. Not looking for reassurance, looking for the seams. They were there. Once you knew to look. He anticipated her questions before she asked them, which she had experienced for months as intuition and now understood as preparation. The way he introduced complexity into the board relationships she thought were hers, casually, lid, helpfully as context she'd needed, in ways that subtly deepened her dependence on his read of the room. The way he talked about the investor group with the authority of someone who had known them for years, which he had understood as a feature of his value, and was now seeing as something else entirely. He was not nervous. That was the thing that stayed with her after the dinner. A man with any genuine concern about the company's position, operating in good faith under real uncertainty, would have some detectable register of nerves as the vote approached. Jeffrey had none. Calm with the specific quality of calm that belongs to someone who knows how the next scene ends and is simply waiting for it to arrive. She drove home and sat in the kitchen with the lights low and thought about her father. Abend Harris had built this company the slow way. Contract by contract, team by team, he had known the name of every crew chief in every facility the company operated. They had known the particular failure modes of the maintenance equipment in Memphis because he had spent time in Memphis watching it work. He had made decisions about the company's future from inside its actual function, from the remove of financial models and investor presentations and the particular language of strategic transformation. She had come home to prove something to a board, had gotten so far inside that proof, so deep into the machinery of demonstrating her own capability, that she had stopped asking whether the thing she was demonstrating was actually what leadership was supposed to produce. Malcolm had asked her, in the 90 seconds before she sent him back to his office with his memo and his USB drive, whether she understood what the data meant for the board's decision. She had understood. She had made a calculation. They had chosen wrong. She did not say this out loud in the kitchen at 11 at night. She sat with it, which was harder. 6 days before the vote, Jeffrey put the first structural piece of his endgame into place. He came to her office mid-morning, did not knock, which he had stopped doing months ago. He sat down with the ease of someone who had established that the rules of entry did not apply to him, the seaman, the same way they applied to everyone else. He told her the financial crisis was accelerating, and a financing agreement had come due and could not be quietly rolled over as it had been twice before. The credit agency was reviewing the company's position and a downgrade was possible within the week. Equance was precisely what it needed to be to justify emergency action on the restructuring vote, which was scheduled, which was ready, which had everything in place. The investor group is prepared to move quickly. They were flat on the desk. Not tense, just placed, the way you place objects you're comfortable with. Any delay makes the terms worse. The current situation is being driven by external market conditions. Restructuring is the only path to stabilization. External market conditions. She let the phrase sit in the air between them without touching it, nodded once, said she understood. watched him leave. Then she opened her laptop and spent the next 3 hours cross-referencing the timing of the vendor financing agreement coming due against the timeline of Caraway Capital's debt acquisitions. The agreement was one of the instruments Caraway had purchased, which meant the person controlling Caraway Capital had just made a decision to let the pressure point activate. Meant either Malcolm was doing exactly what Jeffrey said he was doing, destabilizing deliberately to force the board's hand, or he was doing something else entirely, something that required the pressure to become visible before the vote happened rather than after. She did not know which. She still hadn't heard back from the voicemail. She called Pamela Scott again. Shorter this time. Told Pamela about the vendor agreement and the timing. Pamela said she was tracking it, said she'd been making some calls of her own, said to hold, as if holding were something Vanessa had practiced. The credit downgrade came 41 hours after the vendor agreement default became public to the board. 2 notches, not catastrophic on its own, but not survivable without the appearance of immediate action. The stock dropped 11% in the first trading session after the announcement. Dropped another 7% the following morning. 3 board members called her directly. The calls were polite in the careful way that serious warnings get delivered politely. They expressed confidence. They asked about timelines. They said the restructuring vote couldn't be delayed. They said these things in the tone of people who were not making suggestions. She took each call and said what needed to be said and got off the phone and sat with the growing understanding that the board was not going to save her, not because they were complicit. She didn't believe that, not about most of them, but because they were reading the situation through the information available to them, and that information had been shaped by someone who had been shaping it for 14 months. The picture it presented made the restructuring vote look like the only reasonable response to an emergency that was real enough and urgent enough that questioning it felt irresponsible. She thought about Malcolm's question in the boardroom, he'd asked before he signed the letter. Whether the data would be reviewed by an independent party before the vote. She understood now why he had asked, and she understood what it meant that she had answered the way she did. If arrived at her office on the morning of the 3rd day of the stock decline, did not knock, sat. His demeanor was exactly what it always was. And this was the moment, if there was to be a moment, someone with genuine stakes in the outcome would show something. Some texture of concern. Some register that the situation was moving at a speed requiring real-time recalibration rather than the smooth execution of a prepared sequence. We need the vote to happen on schedule. His hands flat on the desk, placed the way you place things you're entirely comfortable with. Any signal that the timeline is in question will read as instability to the investor group. That's the last thing you want right now. She looked at him. She had been looking at him differently for 10 days, and he had not noticed. I had noticed and decided the margin was still comfortable. She couldn't tell which, and not being able to tell was its own piece of information. She said she understood. He left. She opened the drawer. The memo was still there. Victor's reconciliation results were now in a separate folder beside it. The 2 documents together made an argument that was clear and documented and would be devastating in the right room, presented at the right moment, to the right audience. Later, the question was whether she could get it into the right room before the vote rendered it irrelevant. She still hadn't heard from Caraway Capital. The supplemental disclosure arrived 72 hours before the shareholder meeting. Jeffrey had filed it with the board. She didn't know about it until Harold Reed called her at 7 in the morning. The first time Harold had called her at 7 in the morning in 14 months. And the fact that he was doing so now told her the contents before he read them. Related internal compliance concern related to Vanessa's handling of certain financial communications. Language was precise and legalistic and dense, with the specific kind of technical accuracy that makes a document look like an objective finding, while functioning as something else entirely. Some of the internal correspondence it cited was real. Her actual emails, pulled out of context in ways that changed their meaning without technically misrepresenting the words. Some of it was something she didn't recognize at all, H was a specific kind of violation she couldn't name in the moment, but felt in the chest like a drop in pressure. Together, the filing triggered the company's mandatory internal review process. Under the governance rules Raymond Harris had put in place to protect the company from exactly this kind of bad faith deployment. Governance rules that Jeffrey Lewis had studied carefully before he turned them against the person they were designed to protect. Vanessa's operational authority was placed in provisional status pending board evaluation. Attend the shareholder meeting. She could speak. She could not vote. She could not authorize transactions. She could not unilaterally block the restructuring proposal from reaching a floor vote. In a single filing, Jeffrey had frozen her in place at the exact moment when movement was the only thing that could help her. She read the filing 3 times, then set it down. Then picked it up and read it a 4th time, not because she expected to find something new, but because the repetition was a way of making herself absorb something her brain kept trying to reject. Victor Bryant called mid-morning. That voice carried the careful flatness of a man delivering information he wishes were different. 2 board members who had been sympathetic to her position had shifted overnight. He didn't know why. She told him she wasn't asking him to find out. Larry knew why. Jeffrey had been managing the board relationships she'd thought were hers, managing them longer than she'd been paying attention. He had her email history, her internal communications, map of every conversation she'd had with board members for 14 months, because she had used him as a sounding board, as a strategist, as the person she processed with, and in doing so had handed him the architecture of every relationship she thought was secure. This was what it felt like to understand something fully for the first time and find the understanding arriving a beat too late. Drove to Pamela Scott's house that evening. Did not call first. Pamela lived in a neighborhood in Buckhead, 12 minutes from Vanessa's apartment, a house with a porch light that was always on and a front door that opened before Vanessa could knock. They sat at the kitchen table. Pamela made coffee, did not rush, did not fill the silence with reassurance, as the thing Vanessa needed most and would have trusted least. Just made the coffee and set it down and waited. Vanessa told her everything. The Caraway Capital voicemail that had gone unanswered. The reconciliation Victor had run, the timeline of the vendor agreement coming due, the compliance filing that had arrived that morning. All of it, in sequence without editorial. Pamela listened the way she always listened. Completely. When Vanessa finished, Pamela was quiet for a long moment. Then, you need to understand something about the vote. Her voice carried the steadiness of someone who had been in rooms like this one for 30 years and had learned that clarity was the only useful offering. What you have is enough to change the outcome, but only if it gets into the room before the vote happens. And right now, Jeffrey controls what gets into the room. Unless someone else gets there first. Vanessa's voice came out steadier than she felt. Unless someone else gets there first. Looked at each other across the table. Malcolm hasn't called back. Vanessa set her cup down. I left the message over a week ago. Pamela looked at her for a moment in the way that contains a response being considered before it's given. Those you called. How do you know that? Pamela just looked at her steadily. The way she looked at everything. And Vanessa understood something she should have understood sooner. That Pamela's Saturday morning question about Horizon Air Logistics had not been random. That the board member who had been watching from a slightly different angle had not been watching alone. She drove home at 10:30. The city was doing what cities do at that hour. Lit and moving and indifferent to the specific weight of what was being carried through it. She sat in her car in the parking garage for several minutes after the engine went off. About her father. About the way he had described leadership to her once, when she was in college and asking about the company. He had said the hardest part wasn't making decisions. The hardest part was being honest about which decisions were yours to make and which ones you had handed to someone else without realizing it. She had handed a great many decisions to Jeffrey Lewis. Now she had to go into a shareholder meeting with no authority to act, insufficient board support to block the vote, no word from the one person who held the financial leverage to change the math, attorney seated at the back of the room who was there to advise her, and not permitted to do anything else. The garage was quiet. The concrete absorbed sound the way concrete does, flat and complete. She got out of the car. Right before the shareholder meeting, Vanessa did not sleep. Right, she sat at her desk at home with Victor's reconciliation and the memo and Jeffrey's compliance filing and the investor group documentation and every email chain between her and Jeffrey she could access. She arranged them in chronological order and read through them as a single continuous document, beginning to end, the way you read a story you've been living through when you finally want to understand its shape. The shape was not complicated. That was the most frightening thing about it. When you removed the language that had been placed around it, it was simple. A company with thinning margins and a CEO under pressure. A financial advisor with a prepared structure and a prepared exit. Numbers adjusted not enough to flag, but enough to build an argument. A timeline compressed until the urgency foreclosed the kind of scrutiny that would have caught it. She had been given a role in this, and she had played it. Because she was stupid. Because she had been tired and behind, and willing to hear what she needed to hear from someone who had understood exactly what she needed, and had given it to her precisely calibrated to keep her from looking at the things she couldn't afford to see. At 3 a.m, she wrote a single sentence on a notepad on her desk, looked at it for a while, then put the cap on the pen and closed the notepad and went to make more coffee. The sentence said, "I knew and I chose not to know." Bailey mocked. There was a difference between those two things, and she had been living in the gap between them for months, and she was done with it. Whatever happened in that room tomorrow, however the vote went, and whether Malcolm Hayes chose to walk through that door or stay wherever he was, with his document case and his aircraft and his 9 years of patience, she was done pretending the gap wasn't there. Drank the coffee, watched the city lighten outside the window. Atlanta does not have a dramatic sunrise, not in the middle of fall, not with the cloud cover that had been sitting over the city for a week. It just gradually stops being dark, which is its own kind of beginning. She dressed carefully, not with the formalities she'd brought to the room when she'd forced Malcolm out of the building. Practical, right in the way of someone going into a situation they cannot control and intend to handle anyway. Her attorney met her in the lobby at 8:45. They rode the elevator to the 15th floor without speaking. Attorney had been briefed. He understood his role, advisory, limited, seated at the back. He had also told her in his direct and careful way the previous afternoon that the documentation she had was strong enough. If it reached the room, someone presented it with authority. She had nodded, had not told him who she was counting on to do that. Because she did not know. Because the voicemail had gone unanswered. Because Pamela's words at the kitchen table, "He knows you called," were the only thing pointing toward a possibility she couldn't count on. The conference room on the 15th floor had been arranged for a shareholder meeting, a governance table at the front, the board members in their assigned seats, the general shareholder group arranged in the main body of the room, with the collective tension of people who have been told a meeting is routine and suspect it is not. Lois was already there. Left side of the governance table, investor group's 4 representatives positioned beside him. Men who had flown in from 2 cities, and who looked at the room with the settled patience of people who intended to leave, having gotten what they came for. Jeffrey saw her walk in. He nodded, the nod of a professional. She returned it with the same register and took her seat at the head of the table, because it was still her chair provisionally, however long this meeting took to complete what it had been arranged to complete. Harold Reed opened the meeting, called the first agenda item, invited opening remarks. Jeffrey was already leaning forward, already organized, ready, ahead of everyone in the room by however many moves he had planned for. And then the door at the back of the conference room opened, not loudly, not with drama. Lightway, doors open when the person opening them is not trying to make an entrance but simply arriving where they need to be. Harold did not stop his sentence immediately, but his eyes moved to the door, and then the room's eyes followed his. And Harold's sentence stopped mid-clause because the man walking toward the front was carrying a document case and moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who had arrived exactly when he intended to, and not a moment before. Malcolm Hayes. Axe. Simple jacket. He set the document case on the table at the front of the room, looked at Jeffrey Lewis once, a single, direct look that lasted approximately 2 seconds and communicated nothing dramatic and everything necessary, and then looked at Harold Reed. I have materials relevant to the vote. His voice was what it always was. Level. Unremarkable. The same voice he had used in every operations meeting for 9 years. I'm requesting the floor. Harold Reed had known Malcolm Hayes for nearly a decade. He looked at Jeffrey for one beat, looked back at Malcolm. The floor is open. Jeffrey's hands moved from the table to his lap. Vanessa looked at Malcolm. He did not look at her. He was opening the document case, arranging 3 stacks of printed material with the methodical precision of a person for whom the preparation of materials is function rather than theater. She understood, in that moment, with a clarity that arrived fully formed, was not there to save her. He was there because thousands of people came to work at APEX Aerospace, and someone needed to decide, before this meeting ended, what kind of company they would wake up to tomorrow morning. That was the difference between them. Had always been the difference, and she was only now seeing it clearly enough to name it. Malcolm began to speak. He spoke without notes. The documents in front of him were for the room, not for him. Lived with this material long enough that the structure of it was interior, not memorized in the way of performance, but understood in the way of someone who has worked through a problem until the shape of it becomes part of how they think. Again with the financial discrepancies, not as an accusation, as data, specific, organized, without editorial weight, layered on top of what the numbers already communicated on their own. Owed the gap between the internal revenue forecasts Jeffrey had used to build the restructuring case and the actual contract values Victor Bryant had independently verified. He showed it month by month, laid the direction of the adjustment and its consistency. He explained what the adjustment accomplished, not in the language of fraud, but in the structural language of preparation, like building the conditions for a decision that could only be justified if the company's position looked worse than it was. The room was quiet in the way of people processing rapidly who have decided not to make sounds during that process. Ove to Victor Bryant's reconciliation. Victor, seated with the other executives in the secondary row, kept his eyes forward and his expression composed. He did not look at Jeffrey. He did not need to. To the Caraway Capital debt acquisition trail. He showed how the instruments had been purchased, when and what they represented in terms of operational leverage. Relationship between those instruments and the Vantage Meridian structure that Vanessa's legal team had spent 4 days failing to penetrate. He connected the points without overstating the connections. Let the architecture speak, because the architecture was clear enough on its own, once someone had laid it out without the language that had been placed around it. And then he showed them the last piece. Parallel set of communications between Jeffrey Lewis and 2 members of the investor group, dated across 14 months, which meant they predated Vanessa Carter's tenure as CEO by 2 months. The communications documented, in their own language, the intended sequence. The restructuring vote, the asset transfers that would follow, the specific contracts and proprietary agreements that would move to entities controlled through the investor group's holding structure, like the timeline for Jeffrey's advisory payout, the expected outcome for the company's operational continuity after the core assets were removed, is described, not with concern but with the equanimity of people for whom the operational continuity of the people employed there was not a variable they were tracking. The room had a different quality of stillness by the time he finished. Investor Group's 4 representatives had arrived expecting a procedural vote. They had the stillness now of people who have understood the situation has changed and are calculating what the new situation requires. Not panicking, calculating. They were the kind of people who had been in difficult rooms before and who responded to difficulty with assessment rather than reaction. Jeffrey Lewis looked at the table in front of him. Not at the documents Malcolm had distributed, not at Vanessa, not at the board members whose expressions he had been managing for 14 months. He looked at the surface of the table with the expression of a man running numbers, not feeling, counting. Attorney leaned forward from the chair against the wall, touched his shoulder and said something quietly. Jeffrey shook his head once. A single, minimal movement. Malcolm finished, set his hands flat on the table, looked at Harold Reed, asked if there were any challenges to the materials presented. Jeffrey said nothing. The silence lasted long enough that it became its own kind of answer. Harold Reed called a 5-minute recess. He did not return in 5 minutes, returned in 19. When the conference room door opened again, Harold was accompanied by 2 men in dark coats who had entered the building through the side entrance on the ground floor. One showed credentials to the room with the efficiency of someone who has done this many times and found efficiency more respectful than ceremony. The other walked directly to Jeffrey Lewis, said his name, and asked him to stand. Jeffrey stood, tightened his jacket before he moved. An automatic gesture, the reflex of a man for whom presentation had always been a form of control, reaching for it even now when control had left the room entirely. Then he walked with the 2 men toward the exit, without looking back at the table, without looking at Vanessa, without looking at the investor group representatives, Ivoris Mather, who were now in a quiet conversation with Harold's assistant about the meaning of being asked to remain in the building for further discussion. Their attorney was on the phone before the conference room door finished closing. Home held the silence of something irreversible. Vanessa did not move. She was watching Malcolm, who had closed the document case and was standing at the table with no particular expression. Not relief, not satisfaction, but the vindicated energy of a person who has just prevailed in something they've been working toward. He looked tired, the specific kind that arrives when you have been carrying significant weight for a long time and have finally been permitted to set it down. Harold Reed returned to the front of the room and addressed the shareholders directly. He said the restructuring vote was being suspended pending a full independent audit and a review of the governance procedures that had led to its current form. He said the board would convene an emergency session within 72 hours. All of this in the measured language of institutional authority. The language built specifically for moments after order has dissolved and needs to be reassembled for people who need to believe it can be. When Harold finished, looked at Malcolm and said the board would need to schedule a formal deposition. Malcolm said that was fine. Then Harold looked at Vanessa and said carefully that her provisional operational status would remain in effect pending the board's emergency session, but that the compliance disclosure Jeffrey had filed would itself be subject to review in light of what had been presented this evening. Vanessa nodded. It was all she could do. The room cleared the way rooms clear after something consequential. Rushing, not lingering. The shareholders moved first with the awareness of people who want to process privately before anyone asks them to describe what they witnessed. The investor group's representatives followed with their escorts. The board members moved in pairs, speaking low. Victor caught Vanessa's eye on his way out and gave her a deliberate nod, small and specific that meant something she would think about later. Malcolm was the last to gather his materials, closed the document case, lifted it, turned toward the exit. He had covered half the distance to the door when she said his name. He stopped, didn't turn immediately. When he did, his face held the neutral patience of a man who had anticipated this moment and had not decided yet what to do with it, which meant he had decided. Malcolm Hayes didn't arrive at moments unprepared. Vanessa had not prepared a speech, a person who almost always prepared, who rehearsed important conversations in advance and anticipated responses, and had contingency language ready for the turns a dialogue might take. She had none of that now, standing at the head of a table, in a room that smelled like recycled air and cold coffee, with the wreckage of the past 14 months arranged around her in neat stacks of printed evidence. The only honest thing available was the thing she had been keeping in the top drawer. She told him she owed him an acknowledgement. She told him that when he had come to her office 7 weeks ago with the data, she'd had a choice. They had made the wrong one. She had known on some level that what he was showing her was real. She had chosen Jeffrey's version because it was more convenient for what she was trying to do. She said this without qualification, without mentioning the board or the pressure she'd been under, or the difficulty of inheriting a company mid-crisis, just the plain fact. She had made the wrong call. They and the people who worked for this company had come close to paying for it in ways that had nothing to do with them. Malcolm listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment that was not avoidance. He had known about the financial irregularities before he brought the memo to her office. He had known 4 months before that meeting. He had spent those 4 months trying to determine whether she was complicit or being managed. He said the Peachtree City visit, the one she had conducted believing herself undetected, had been flagged to him within 8 minutes of her arriving in the lot. Allowed it because he needed to understand what she would do with the information and what she had done, going to Victor Bryant, attempting to reach Caraway Capital, not sharing what she'd seen with Jeffrey, had told him what he needed to know. Vanessa absorbed this. The understanding that she had been assessed from a distance by the man she had dismissed, that her surveillance of him had been permitted because he needed data. It wasn't comfortable. It was accurate. She asked what he was going to do with the Caraway Capital position. Direct, because there was no longer any reason to be otherwise. He said the instruments would be restructured on terms favorable to the company's long-term stability, through attorneys, through the board. Fully disclosed in the audit, Caraway Capital had no interest in dismantling APEX Aerospace. It had never had that interest. Had accumulated those positions, specifically to prevent someone else from using them as a mechanism for exactly what Jeffrey Lewis had been building toward. Then he said something that changed the register of his voice. For the first time all evening, he said that Lorraine had built Caraway's original framework to protect companies like this one. Companies where the work that kept aircraft safe was being treated as an asset to extract rather than a function to sustain. He said he had continued it in her name because he did not know a better reason to continue anything. Home was empty around them. Atlanta at night ran its lights outside the windows, warmer somehow in the dark, less certain of itself and more honest for it. Vanessa asked about Horizon Air Logistics. Malcolm said it was his. Over the years with Lorraine. 2 logistics contracts and a leased warehouse in Indianapolis at the start. Then growth that neither of them had originally planned for, but both had recognized as necessary. Eisen and Caraway working in parallel. One managing the operational supply chain that companies like Apex depended on. The other holding the financial instruments that determined whether those companies survived pressure or broke under it. Together, a position that could protect or dismantle, depending on who held it, depending on what they chose. The point had never been to use that position against anyone. It had been to ensure that someone with different intentions couldn't use a similar position against the people who showed up every day and did the work that actually mattered. Vanessa understood, for the first time, architecture of what she had been standing inside without knowing it. Malcolm had not been a mid-level director who happened to have resources. He had been the weight-bearing structure beneath a company that had no idea he was there. That would have cascaded into failure if he had simply walked away and left it unsupported. She asked why. He had the resources, the track record. He could have been on the board, led the company formally with his name on the door. Why 9 years on the 14th floor, parking a decade-old truck in the general lot, eating lunch at a diner with menus that never changed? Considered it with the same attention he had given the financial documents. He said the work he found meaningful was the operational work. The actual function of keeping complex systems running, solving problems with real consequences. The person who knew where the freight delays were and how to fix them before they cascaded into something worse. Titles and offices were not why he showed up. Learned over time that the further a person moved from the actual work into the language describing the work, the more their decisions tended toward the wrong reasons. He had no interest in being that person. Lorraine had understood this about him before he had fully understood it himself. And then, before he picked up the document case, he said one more thing. He said the board would restore her authority once the audit cleared, which it would. She accepted, she should spend some time inside the operations she was responsible for. Not reading reports about them, inside them. The company's real value was not in the contracts or the stock price or any document presentable to a board. Maintenance crews and the logistics coordinators and the supply chain managers who made certain that aircraft were functional and safe and airworthy. CEO who understood that, from the inside, was a different kind of leader than one who didn't. He said it without condescension. The way you say a true thing when you mean it practically and not as judgment. Picked up the document case and walked out. Vanessa stood in the empty conference room and let the quiet settle. Outside, Atlanta continued its evening, lit and complete and entirely unaware of what had just been decided in this building. In fact, she thought about the morning she had stood at this same glass with her palms pressed against it, watching a Gulf Stream carry a man she had believed she was watching lose. She had been wrong about that, and about a great deal else, the same moment. The particular quality of that wrongness, the way it didn't diminish with time, but changed its shape, from embarrassment into something with more weight and more use, was something she would carry for a long time, not as punishment, as information, the kind you don't get from a financial model, the kind that costs something to learn. Aid's emergency session happened 68 hours after the shareholder meeting ended, 68 hours, not 72, which was the timeline Harold had announced to the room. 68, because 3 board members had called Harold directly the morning after and said they didn't need the full window. Because what had been presented in that conference room did not require extended deliberation. Because some things, seen clearly, do not benefit from additional time to reconsider. Vanessa arrived at the session with Victor Bryant beside her and her attorney behind her, and nothing prepared except the truth, decided sometime in the early hours of the previous morning, was the only thing worth bringing into that room. The Jeffrey Lewis compliance disclosure was formally invalidated within the first 20 minutes. The board's outside counsel walked through it point by point and identified the specific ways in which excerpted communications had been removed from context, and the specific ways in which 2 documents in the filing appeared to have been constructed rather than retrieved from any legitimate internal record. The language was measured and technical. The conclusion was not. The internal review was closed. Vanessa's provisional status was lifted, full operational authority restored. She sat at the table and received this information with the stillness of someone who has been through enough in the past 10 days that good news arrives with the same quality of weight as bad news. Not relief exactly, like the moment. After you've been holding your breath without knowing it, and your body finally remembers how to function. First, Harold Reed looked at her across the table when the formal language was done and said the board was offering her a clean confirmation for the next fiscal year's leadership cycle. Played it with the careful formality of a man who understood that what he was offering was not just authority restored, but a judgment rendered. About who she was, about what the past 14 months had actually been, about the difference between the decision she'd made in her office with Malcolm's memo and the decisions she'd made in the weeks that followed it. She accepted, said thank you in a way that was genuine and brief. Then she said she had a request. Harold looked at her. The other board members looked at her. Victor, seated 1 chair down, did not look at her because he had heard this request the previous afternoon and had said, in his careful and accurate way, that the board would either support it or they wouldn't, and that either outcome would tell her something useful. She asked for 60 days, not to strategize, to develop a new plan or reassess the financial models or build a presentation about her vision for the company's next phase. She asked for 60 days in the field, operational immersion in the company's working divisions before she resumed full executive responsibilities. She specified what she meant. Not oversight, not a listening tour, not the kind of visibility exercise where you spend 3 days at a facility, shake hands, eat with the crew, and leave with photographs that get posted to the company intranet. She wanted to be assigned to actual working teams, maintenance, scheduling, supply chain coordination, vendor management. She wanted to learn how the company functioned from inside the function itself rather than from the floor above it. Harold looked at her for a long moment, spoke of a man recalibrating something he thought he had already calibrated correctly. The board will support that request. He said it without qualification. without the cautious optimism the board had brought to her original appointment 14 months ago. Something cleaner than that, frankly mocked. Something that arrived specifically from watching a person ask for accountability rather than waiting to be held accountable. She started in Memphis 3 days later. Memphis facility handled heavy airframe maintenance for 3 regional carriers and 2 cargo operators. The second largest facility APEX Aerospace operated, and it ran on a schedule that predated sunrise by an hour and did not accommodate the kinds of interruptions that executive visits typically generated. The crew chiefs had been told someone from the leadership level would be joining the teams for an extended period. They had been told she would be working, not observing. They had received this information with the collective skepticism of people who have heard similar things before and have developed calibrated expectations about what those things tend to mean in practice. Vanessa arrived on a Monday morning at 5:15. The facility smelled like metal and hydraulic fluid and something she couldn't name at first that turned out to be a specific brand of industrial cleaner used on the hangar floors every night. Lighting was high and direct and clinical in the way that environments built around precision tend to be. There was no softness in the space. It was built to hold aircraft and the people who worked on them and to do both without apology. Assigned to Bay 3. The crew chief responsible for Bay 3 was Terry Coleman. Terry Coleman was 61 years old and had been doing this work for 22 years. Apex, he had worked at 2 other maintenance facilities and 1 regional carrier's internal maintenance department. He had the hands of someone who had been using them continuously for decades, thick through the knuckles, marked with the small permanent evidence of work that involves edges and heat, and the occasional miscalculation that leaves its record in the skin. Moved through the hangar, with the unhurried authority of someone who has been in a space long enough that the space has reorganized itself around his presence rather than the other way around. To adjust his communication style for Vanessa's arrival, this was what she had asked for. It was also, in the first several days, more difficult to navigate than she had anticipated. Not because Terry was unkind, because he was precise. Made a mistake, and she made mistakes with the regularity of someone operating genuinely outside their domain. He identified it, explained the correct procedure, and moved on. No softening, no acknowledgement that the person making the mistake had any formal authority over anyone in that hangar, just the correction. Offered with the same directness, he offered corrections to everyone else on the team. Most weeks she made mistakes that required correction 12 times. She counted, not obsessively, as a way of measuring where she was against where she needed to be. The second week, the number was 7. By the third week, she could read a maintenance log and understand what it was actually telling her. Not the summary. She had been reading summaries for 14 months and understood summaries. The log itself, a sequence of decisions embedded in the entries. The judgment calls that never appeared in the formal record, but were visible in the gap between what was documented and what had clearly been considered. Institutional knowledge that lived in the way a crew chief wrote up a finding in the specific language used to describe a deviation that was within tolerance, but worth noting, the things they chose to put in writing, and the things they chose to say out loud instead. But she started to understand that the company's actual operational intelligence was distributed across people who had never attended a board meeting and never would, and that the reports she had been reading as CEO, the documents she had used to make decisions about maintenance protocols and staffing levels and equipment replacement cycles, were translations of that intelligence into a language that management could process. Something disappeared in every translation. Not through dishonesty. Through the inherent limitation of representing lived, embodied, stated knowledge in a format that could be projected on a screen in a conference room on the 15th floor. Decision to increase the maintenance scheduling throughput in Memphis by 12%. A decision she had made 7 months ago based on a productivity analysis that had looked entirely reasonable from the executive level, had been implemented without anyone in the executive suite, understanding that it required 2 of the senior crew chiefs to absorb the additional load in ways that weren't visible in the scheduling data. They had absorbed it. The work had gotten done. The throughput numbers had come in as projected. But the two crew chiefs had been working at a pace that wasn't sustainable. Not dangerously, not in a way that compromised safety in any measurable sense, in a way that was quietly, steadily wearing at the margin of care that the work required. The kind of wear that doesn't show up in quarterly reports. The kind that builds until someone makes a different kind of mistake. The kind that does show up, at which point the analysis will identify the individual error and miss entirely the conditions that produced it. Found this out not from a report, from standing beside a crew chief named Walter Briggs at 6:45 in the morning on a Thursday, watching him work through a pre-inspection checklist with the careful speed of someone who had done this particular task 10,000 times and was doing it faster than it should be done because the schedule required it. They didn't say anything in the moment. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she went to Terry Coleman. The throughput target, she said. The 12% increase from February. Terry looked at her, looked back at the engine component he was logging. What about it? It's not workable. He set the component down, looked at her directly, for the first time, in a way that was different from the way he looked at her when correcting a procedural error. Look at someone when you're deciding whether they mean what they just said or whether they're performing something? No, he said. It's not. How long has it not been workable? Since February. She held that. Why didn't anyone flag it? Terry picked the component back up. Someone did. Filed a scheduling concern in March. Went to regional ops. Evil. Got back a note saying the target was set at the executive level and would be reassessed at the annual review. Annual review was 4 months away. She pulled the March filing when she got back to the temporary office she'd been assigned. 8 in 40 minutes. A 2-paragraph document filed by Walter Briggs, organized clearly, describing exactly the dynamic she had observed on Thursday morning. Routed to regional operations, acknowledged, filed, not escalated, because anyone had made a bad decision about it. Because the system for escalating concerns from the facility level to the executive level had been designed by people who understood the executive level and not the facility level. The friction was structural. It wasn't malice. It was the friction of 2 different worlds connected by a reporting pathway that neither world fully understood. She revised the throughput target that afternoon. Ike sent the revision to the regional operations director with a note explaining the reasoning and asking him to identify any other current targets that had been set at the executive level without facility-level input. They'd not mention the March filing. She asked for a forward-looking process rather than a retrospective accounting. The regional operations director called her back 2 hours later. He sounded, she thought, slightly surprised, out at the revision, at the call itself, at the fact that it was coming from where it was coming from and sounding the way it sounded. She was beginning to understand what that meant. 3 weeks into her time in Memphis on a Tuesday morning, and Terry were standing at the entrance to Bay 3, watching a cargo aircraft engine being reassembled after a major inspection. The team worked with the coordinated efficiency of people who have done this specific task together many times. There was very little verbal communication. Work was mostly silent, except for the sounds of tools and components, and the occasional brief exchange of technical shorthand between people who had developed a shared language over years of working in the same space. Terry stood beside her with his coffee and watched in a way that suggested he was always watching, even when he appeared to be at rest. She had learned to recognize this quality in him over 3 weeks, the attention that didn't announce itself, it without looking at her, without preamble, without framing it as advice or instruction or the deliberate delivery of a lesson. A plane doesn't know who owns it. It only knows who takes care of it. She looked at the engine, looked at the hands working on it, at the particular care with which a technician named Jerome was seating a component that would bear significant load at altitude, where the consequences of imprecision were not recoverable by anyone on the ground. I didn't respond. Neither did Terry. The sentence had been said or thought aloud or both, and it sat in the hangar air between them and did its work without requiring anything additional from either of them. Carried it back to Atlanta 6 weeks later. not as a lesson to deploy in a presentation, as a fact about the world that she had learned by being inside the world rather than above it. It took 83 days. The results were reviewed by the board's independent auditors, and 2 outside firms engaged specifically for the scope of what had been alleged. They examined the internal forecasts, the contract records, the debt acquisition trail through Caraway Capital, the relationship between the financial adjustments and Jeffrey Lewis's advisory agreement. The communications Malcolm had presented at the shareholder meeting had been obtained through a legal process the auditors documented fully and found unimpeachable. Vanessa was interviewed 4 times. Victor Bryant was interviewed 6. Harold Reed twice. Pamela Scott once, at her own request. Akers, she said she preferred once and comprehensive to multiple sessions, covering the same ground with different people, asking the questions. The audit closed without material findings against the company's current leadership. This was announced to the board in a session that felt, in its specificity and its quiet, nothing like the shareholder meeting had felt. The shareholder meeting had been a room in crisis. This was a room doing the slower, less dramatic work of accountability, which looks different from the outside and feels different from the inside, and accomplishes something that crisis cannot. Lois had been charged with securities fraud and wire fraud in a federal proceeding that would occupy several years of his professional life and leave him with few options on the other side of it. The 4 investor group representatives had each reached civil settlements negotiated separately and had been removed from any formal or informal association with APEX Aerospace going forward. The terms of the settlements were confidential. The fact of them was not. The Caraway Capital debt restructuring had been completed during the audit period, handled entirely through attorneys and the board's financial advisors. Malcolm Hayes had not appeared in any meeting or call or corridor during the process. He had communicated through legal channels only, and the terms that emerged from those communications were described by the board's independent financial advisors as unusually favorable to the company's long-term stability. Not favorable in the way that happens when someone is making a concession to resolve a difficult situation quickly. Favorable in the way that happens when the party on the other side of the negotiation is not optimizing for what they can extract. His name appeared in the final audit report in one place. A single footnote. Managing partner of Caraway Capital. State cooperation had facilitated the company's debt resolution. That was the entire formal record connecting him to the outcome. One footnote. For 9 years of weight-bearing that the company had never known was happening, which was, Vanessa thought when she read it, exactly right. Not because he deserved obscurity, because he had never needed anything else. She returned to the Atlanta headquarters on a Wednesday morning 6 months after the shareholder meeting. The building looked the same as it always had. Glass and concrete. The Atlanta skyline visible through the lobby windows, the security desk in the same position it had occupied since the building opened. Evany, the guard who had been at that desk for 11 years, nodded at her when she came through the door. She said good morning to him by name. He looked briefly surprised. Then he nodded again, with something different in it. Her office on the 15th floor had been maintained by facilities during her absence. Same furniture, same view of the city she had stared at during the long nights of the previous year, except now she knew what was happening below that view, in ways she hadn't known before. She knew the maintenance scheduling cycles for the facilities that kept the commercial carriers operating, the supply chain pressure points that Horizon Air Logistics managed without anyone at the carrier level necessarily knowing who was managing them. She let a maintenance log actually says it when you read it at the level of the person writing it. Rather than the level of the executive receiving the summary, she knew that knowledge wouldn't stay current if she stopped renewing it, which was precisely what Malcolm had been doing for 9 years, renewing it. Just staying inside the actual function of the work rather than ascending to the description of that function and remaining there. Understood now why he had parked in the general lot every morning, not as modesty, not as performance of a particular kind of character, because the 3-minute walk from the far end of that lot to the building entrance was 3 minutes of being in the world at the level of the people who worked there, of hearing the conversations that happened in that space, noticing the things visible from that angle that were not visible from the executive parking structure on level 2. Small things. But the small things were where the actual state of a system lived, and the actual state of a system was what you needed to understand in order to make decisions that didn't produce damage downstream that you couldn't see coming. She started parking in the general lot her first week back. Bryant noticed but didn't mention it, which was the appropriate response. As a Young came to work for Vanessa in the 3rd week of her return. Nobody had arranged this. Angela had submitted a formal transfer request through HR while Vanessa was still in Memphis. The request had been approved through the normal process. When Vanessa came back and found Angela at the desk outside her office, she understood without being told that Angela had made a choice, a specific and deliberate one, a kind that didn't require explanation but communicated something regardless. Angela ran the office the way she had always run things, completely, efficiently, and with the particular institutional knowledge of someone who has been inside an organization long enough to understand where the actual load-bearing walls are and which ones are decorative. She adapted to Vanessa's rhythms inside 2 weeks, which said something about Angela's skill and something about the fact that certain ways of working are more learnable than others because they are more honest than others. One morning in early November, 4 months after Vanessa's return, they placed something on the corner of Vanessa's desk before the day's first meeting. A photograph, small, printed on regular paper, slightly faded at the edges, like the colors of a picture that has been printed and stored rather than professionally preserved. It showed 2 people standing in front of what appeared to be a loading dock. A logistics warehouse from the look of the background. Industrial, functional, nothing designed to look like anything other than what it was. Malcolm Hayes and a woman Vanessa had never seen. They were standing close together, not posed exactly, like they had both turned toward the camera mid-conversation, and someone had captured them in that moment. They were laughing, not at the camera, at something outside the frame, something between them that had made them both turn the same way at the same moment with the same ease. The woman was Lorraine. Vanessa knew this without being told, because the woman had the same quality of presence that Malcolm's brief descriptions of her had created. Not beautiful in the arranged, deliberate way, in the way that people are vital. When they are doing exactly the thing they are built to do, and they know it, and they are doing it beside someone they trust completely. Standing in front of a warehouse at a loading dock, and she looked like someone who owned the air around her. On the back of the photograph, handwriting. Careful but not slow. Writing of someone who thought quickly and wrote to keep up with the thinking rather than to produce a document. Year 1. M&L Vanessa turned the photograph over, looked at the 2 people in front of the warehouse, looked at the building behind them, the early evidence of what would come Horizon Air Logistics. Before it became what it became, it was 2 contracts and a leased space and 2 people who understood what they were building and why they were building it. She set the photograph back down on the corner of the desk where Angela had placed it. She did not move it, like that was the only response available, and it was the right one. The company's credit position stabilized by the end of the year. A downgrade was reversed at one of the 2 notches within 4 months, and the second followed the quarter after the audit results were published. The commercial division revenue, the actual revenue, measured against actual contracts, out the directional adjustment that had been embedded in the projections for 8 months, was not comfortable, but it was real. And real problems, Vanessa had learned in Memphis and was continuing to learn in Atlanta, respond to real responses in ways that manufactured problems do not. She spent the first 6 months back, focused on 2 structural changes that had nothing to do with the financial recovery and everything to do with what the financial crisis had exposed about how the company actually functioned. Was the escalation pathway problem she had identified from Walter Briggs's March filing. They commissioned a review of every concern filed at the facility level in the previous 2 years that had been acknowledged but not escalated to the executive level. There were 43 of them. She read each one. They had Victor build a financial analysis of the cost of the issues that had eventually materialized from the ones that had been quietly filed and forgotten. The number was not small. More importantly, had the review team identify the structural reasons the escalation hadn't happened. Not the individuals responsible, but the design failures in the system itself. The places where the pathway between the person who saw the problem and the person with the authority to address it had been interrupted by layers that neither understood what was being passed through them nor had any incentive to keep it moving. My design took 4 months. It was not elegant, it was specific and procedural, and required training at multiple levels and created friction in places where there had been false smoothness before. Terry Coleman had agreed to join a small advisory group for the redesign process, said during one of the working sessions that the goal was not to make it easier to report problems. That the goal was to make it impossible for problems to stay invisible once someone had seen them. The problem isn't that people don't speak up, he said, his voice carrying the flatness of someone stating something he has known for a long time. The problem is that speaking up goes somewhere, and then stops. She wrote that sentence on the whiteboard and left it there for the rest of the working session, and took a photograph of it before facilities cleaned the board that night. The second structural change was understanding Horizon Air logistics. Not from a control perspective, because Horizon was not hers to control, and she had come to understand that fully and found it, hence she stopped thinking about it in terms of organizational authority, actually reassuring. But from the operational integration perspective, because Horizon managed supply chain coordination for APEX's maintenance network in ways that had been largely invisible to the executive suite, and invisible dependencies in complex systems were the kind of thing that looked like stability right up until the moment they didn't. They wanted to understand the dependency, not to reduce it. The partnership was too well functioning to disrupt, and the disruption would serve no one. But to be honest with the board about what APEX actually relied on, to name the architecture rather than benefit from it without acknowledging it, she had her team document the Horizon relationship fully. Had the documentation reviewed by outside advisors with no prior knowledge of the relationship's history. Had the reviewed documentation presented to the board, with a recommendation that the relationship be formalized through a long-term supply chain partnership agreement with transparent terms on both sides. The board approved the recommendation in the same session. Harold Reed said afterward quietly, that it was the first time in his experience that an executive had voluntarily disclosed a beneficial dependency they could have continued benefiting from anonymously. She told him she had learned that invisible things have a way of becoming crises. Looked at her in the way he had been looking at her lately, with the recalibrated read of someone who had made a judgment about a person, and found the person had moved past where the judgment placed them. Horizon Air Logistics sent a single attorney to the partnership agreement signing, professional, prepared, and entirely circumspect about her principle, beyond what was required to execute the agreement. The agreement was signed, Ernie left, and Horizon continued its supply chain coordination work across the APEX maintenance network exactly as it had before, quietly without acknowledgement, the way infrastructure functions when it functions correctly and doesn't need to announce itself. Malcolm Hayes was not present at the signing. He was not present anywhere in the building during the 6 months following the shareholder meeting, had not called, had not sent a message through any channel, not made his presence felt in any of the ways that people feel entitled to make their presence felt when they have done something consequential on someone else's behalf and would like that fact recognized. Vanessa had, at various points during those 6 months, thought about what she would say to him if the opportunity arrived. She had composed versions of it in the early mornings, driving to Memphis during the operational immersion, sitting in the Crown Diner once on a Thursday afternoon, not for any reason she could articulate cleanly, just because it was a place where the coffee came in ceramic mugs, and the menus hadn't changed in years, and she wanted to sit in it for a while and understand something she couldn't name yet. Diane Wells had brought her coffee without asking what she wanted, looked at her for a moment, didn't say anything, which was the appropriate response and the most honest one available. December. 4 months after her return to Atlanta, Pamela Scott called on a Saturday morning. The call lasted 20 minutes and covered several things: board governance, the upcoming Q4 review, a conference Pamela was attending in Dallas the following month, and then, near the end, as naturally as asking about the weather, Raymond called me last week. Her father had stepped back from the company 18 months ago for health reasons and had not been in contact with the board since. Who she had spoken to twice since the shareholder meeting, both calls brief and careful in the way that calls between people who love each other and are processing something complicated tend to be. He asked about you. Pamela's voice was even. I told him what I've seen. Which is what? A pause. Not for effect. The pause of someone choosing words with care because the words matter. Not performing it. Doing it. Vanessa held the phone and looked out the window at Atlanta on a December Saturday. Mild, the particular quality of a southern winter that never fully commits to being winter. Tell him I'll call, she said. She did. That evening, her father picked up on the second ring. Raymond Harris was 67 years old and had built APEX Aerospace from 3 leased aircraft and a freight contract into the company his daughter was now running. He did not say anything profound on the call. He asked about Memphis, about the audit, about whether she was eating enough, which was a question he asked because he was her father, and because certain habits of parenthood don't reconfigure around corporate timelines or professional achievements. They answered all of it honestly, which for the last question meant not entirely. He said, near the end of the call, "You know what I always said was the most important thing. You said a lot of things, Dad. The most important one." They thought about it. She knew. Don't be the last person to know what's happening in your own building. That's the one. He said it with the satisfaction of a person whose long investment has returned something specific and recognizable. There yet? Getting there. Good. A pause that carried more than it needed to. That's enough. She was in Memphis in early January, back for the first of what would become quarterly working visits, when the voicemail arrived. She was working with Walter Briggs on a documentation review. The two of them standing at a work table in the temporary office off Bay 3, with the actual log and the scheduling record and a notepad, talking through a maintenance interval that had been flagged as potentially early. Terry Coleman was across the hangar, running through a systems check on a separate aircraft. The morning was loud in the specific way that hangars are loud, metal and machinery providing a constant backdrop against which everything else occurs. Her phone lit up on the table. An Atlanta number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail, finished the conversation with Walter, then stepped away from the table and listened. The voice was not one she had heard before, a man, measured, professional, identifying himself as calling on behalf of the managing partner of Caraway Capital. It was not available to call directly, but who wanted to pass along a response to the voicemail Vanessa had left before the shareholder meeting, the one she had nearly stopped expecting a response to. The message said the managing partner appreciated the directness of her outreach and had followed the subsequent developments with interest. It said the debt restructuring had been completed on the terms the attorneys had agreed, and that those terms reflected the managing partner's assessment of what the company required for long-term stability rather than what the circumstances might have permitted him to extract. It said that Horizon Air Logistics would continue its supply chain coordination work under the partnership agreement, and that the managing partner viewed the formalization as evidence of exactly the kind of institutional honesty that APEX Aerospace had not always demonstrated and would benefit from sustaining. And then, at the end, something that had clearly been asked to be included verbatim, because the language shifted register from the rest of the message. People who keep aircraft in the air deserve a company that understands why they show up. That was it. No further instruction, no invitation, no indication of where Malcolm Hayes was, or what he was doing, or whether the distance between them would ever close from what it had been, since he picked up the document case and walked out of the shareholder meeting room, placed in the hangar with the phone in her hand, and the message finished and the sounds of Bay 3 filling the space around her. metal, hydraulic fluid, the industrial cleaner she now knew by name, the quiet, coordinated efficiency of people who had been doing this work for years and understood it at a level that no executive summary had ever fully captured. She put the phone in her pocket, walked back to the work table, where Walter was waiting with the maintenance log and the scheduling record and the question about the maintenance interval. She sat down, picked up the pen, and they kept working. There are things that get built slowly enough that you can't see them happening while they happen. Lorraine Mitchell had understood this. She had built Caraway Capital's original framework over years. Acquiring positions in company did protection, rather than extraction, creating the conditions under which someone with the wrong intentions would find the leverage they were looking for, or by someone with different ones. They'd done it without announcement, without press releases or conference panels, or any of the architecture of visibility that people use to signal that important work is being done. Oh, she had done it because the work was real, and the people it protected were real, and the alternative was to watch the system produce the outcome it was designed to produce. The transfer of value from the people doing work to the people describing work from a sufficient remove that the description came to feel like ownership. Malcolm had continued it. Not identically, he was not Lorraine, and grief doesn't function as a template for anything. But in the spirit of what she had built, the patient, unglamorous work of maintaining the conditions under which other work could happen safely. 9 years in an office on the 14th floor with a view of the freight loading docks, working on the actual problems, staying inside the actual system, knowing where the freight delays were and how to fix them before they cascaded into something that couldn't be fixed quietly, and then, when the moment required it, doing the one visible thing. By walking into a shareholder meeting with a document case and 3 stacks of printed materials and 24 minutes of plain, organized, unhurried presentation that changed the outcome for thousands of people who would never know his name in connection with it. He didn't need them to. That was the thing Vanessa had been working to understand for 6 months, and was still working to understand and expected to be working on for a long time after that. The relationship between power and visibility, assumption she had carried into the CEO chair. That leading meant being seen leading, that authority required its own announcement, that the purpose of a decision was part to demonstrate that you were the kind of person who made decisions. Malcolm had made different choices for different reasons, and had built something real and durable and largely invisible. She had made her choices and nearly lost everything Raymond Harris had spent 40 years constructing. Not through malice, a particular blindness of someone operating at the level of description rather than function, confident in the map while the territory was doing something the map hadn't accounted for. The territory was always doing something. In fact, the question was whether you were inside it or above it when it happened, in March. 7 months after her return to Atlanta, Vanessa proposed a formal mentorship structure connecting executive-level leaders with facility-level crew chiefs and operations specialists, not a shadowing program, not a listening initiative with a name and a logo and a launch event. A structured, ongoing exchange into which executive decisions affecting operational protocols would be reviewed by working-level advisors before implementation, in which working-level advisors would have a formal channel for escalating concerns that bypassed the regional operations layer that had swallowed Walter Briggs' March filing without passing it upward. The proposal went to the board with Victor Bryant's financial analysis attached. Analysis showed the documented cost of 11 decisions made at the executive level in the previous 2 years without working-level input that had produced downstream damage invisible until it became expensive. 11 decisions. 4 of them Vanessa had made herself. Included that fact in the proposal not as confession or performance of accountability, but as context for why the structural change was necessary and why it needed to be permanent rather than discretionary. The board approved it in the same session. Terry Coleman agreed to serve as the first working-level advisor on the new structure. He said yes in the same way he said everything, without preamble, without condition, The flatness of someone for whom agreement means you're ready to do the thing and not that you're ready to discuss doing it. She told him she was grateful. He said, "Let's see if it works first," which was the right response. Which was, earning, almost always the right response to anything that mattered. On a Thursday morning in April, Vanessa stood at the entrance to Bay 3 at 5:45 and watched the Atlanta sky begin its gradual shift from dark to something lighter. The city was audible at that hour in a particular way. The sounds of a large place beginning its day, the interstate building toward its morning volume, the aircraft arriving at Hartsfield-Jackson from the overnight routes, the cargo planes completing their pre-dawn operations on the far side of the field. She thought about the Gulf Stream. About the morning she had stood with her palms flat against the glass of the 15th floor conference room and watched it climb south over Atlanta until it was a white shape against gray and then nothing. She had been certain, in that moment, that she was watching defeat. A man who had tried to bring her information she didn't want to receive, who had been removed from the building efficiently, now was airborne in an aircraft she hadn't known existed heading somewhere she couldn't follow. She had understood that incorrectly in almost every dimension. He had not been defeated. He had been patient. There was a difference she had not had the frame to see at the time, and now had a version of, still incomplete, still being built from inside facilities that smelled like metal, and hydraulic fluid and an industrial cleaner she now knew by name. Somewhere, Malcolm Hayes was in motion. She didn't know where, she didn't need to know. The partnership agreement was in place, the Caraway restructuring was complete. The audit was closed. The thousands of people who came to work at APEX Aerospace's facilities across the country did not know that their continued employment had been protected by a man who had spent 9 years parking in the employee lot and eating lunch at a diner with laminated menus, and they didn't need to know either. The protection had worked. The work continued. The people showed up. That was the point. That had always been the point. She had just taken a long time to understand it, which was costly, and which she intended to make mean something going forward rather than just carrying the cost as weight. Terry Coleman arrived at 5:53 and walked past her into the bay without stopping, coffee in hand, already running through the day's schedule in whatever internal process he used to organize his mornings. He glanced at her once on his way past. Just that. A glance that contained neither approval nor disapproval, nor any particular message. She followed him in. There was work to do. She was finally learning how to do it. Somewhere over the country at 43,000 feet, a Gulf Stream moved through airspace above a city that would not appear in any press release. The man in the forward cabin had dark slacks and a simple jacket and a document case on the table in front of him, closed now, the work inside it completed, looking out the window at the geography below. The grid of lights that marked a city going about its evening, unaware of the aircraft above it, unaware of the man inside it, unaware of the particular invisible weight that certain people choose to carry, so that the systems beneath them continue to hold. Below him, in a hangar in Memphis, the maintenance logs were being updated for the day's completed work. Jerome was finishing a component installation with the care of someone who understands that altitude removes the possibility of correction. Walter Briggs was reviewing a scheduling variance against the new protocols. Terry Coleman was walking the perimeter of Bay 3 with the authority of someone for whom the space itself has learned to make room, checking the things that needed checking, the things that needed to be found before they became the things that couldn't be fixed. And Vanessa Carter was sitting at a work table with the actual log in front of her. Not the summary, the log itself, learning to read what it said at the level it was written rather than the level at which it was received. The aircraft climbed, the night held its dark. And the work continued, the way it always continues, the hands of the people who have never stopped doing it and never needed anyone to know their names in order to keep going. He did not need the story to end with his name attached to the outcome. He never had.